Last week there was a coup, then Myanmar's military banned protests, and yet a new generation of pro-democracy protesters is still returning to the streets. In fact, their numbers might even be growing. There are reports of some police siding with demonstrators. How many, we'll ask. Many still feel fear, a bloodbath, like so many times before. Which way will it go? It's only been 9 days since the generals threw out civilians, canceled election results where they were routed, and detained Aung San Suu Kyi along with the president and most senior leaders of her National League for Democracy. But going underground is new for the generation that came of age during the past decade, in a country now fully connected to the outside world. Case in point, the sound of banging pots and pans that we heard last week in Myanmar, now coming not from Yangon but Bangkok, where Thai pro-democracy activists have been inspired by their peers in Myanmar, and where the military-backed regime is also trying to put a lid on dissent. How far can this new wave carry in Southeast Asia? Today in the France 24 debate, we're asking which way it will go in Myanmar. Joining us, he was our man in Southeast Asia in a previous life, France 24 senior correspondent Cyril Payan. How are you, sir?
Hello, how are you?
I'm all right. From London, Tun Kin, who is president of the Burmese Rohingya organization UK. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And we welcome back from Bangkok, Phil Robertson, Deputy Director of Human Rights Watch's Asia Division.
Good to see you all.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter. The hashtag is F24debate. Her name is Mya Twat Kang. 2 days before her 20th birthday, the university student shot in the head with live ammunition at an anti-coup rally in the capital. Demonstrators across the country this Wednesday chanting her name as doctors fight to save her life. Her sister, who, by the way, was alongside her when that live ammo was used. Tun Kin, when we were watching on this show Monday, it was just as they were announcing martial law for Yangon and Mandalay. We thought, all right, things could quieten down, and they haven't. Are you surprised?
Yes, compared with the past demonstration in 1988, the Crackdown and 2007, compared with that, this Generation Z is very encouraging, and they are really brave. And it is, I'm very happy to see that new generation of Burma are, coming out of the streets, and demonstration been going on many cities across the country, and the people are. We have seen different pictures, different groups, and all the level, all the communities, workers and CDM, civil disobedient movement is very moving forward. So this is 21st century military coup power, and this is what we want to see, and this is what we can see now. This is very good.
All right, the very first day, Cyril Payan, reaction was a little muted. It seems to have gathered pace, though, since the weekend.
Well, I guess people were very surprised because there were lots of rumors spreading in Rangoon and Naypyidaw, the capital city, a few days earlier. Even some embassies, 16 embassies from the West, put some very strong statements against the temptation of the new coup. But people were not really buying this thing that the coup will actually happen, especially because we thought there were some different views inside the military, inside the Tatmadaw, with younger generations maybe not keen enough to go again, to be so to bring some hostility in the country. Then the coup happened, and it was like absolutely a big surprise. It came at dawn on Monday, and so violently. It's like in few hours we come back 20 years earlier by arresting Aung San Suu Kyi, by arresting the elected president, and by imposing martial law for 1 year. So it was a bit of a shock. And then the people organize, and you have a lot of resilience, sadly, and it's a good thing too in the Burmese psyche, because people have been, even if the Z generation, the millennials, they have been in a bit trained by what is going on, because their parents, generation to generations, for decades, have been under military dictatorship. So they knew that something will be maybe stolen from them, and there's no time to spare.
All right, the South China Morning Post publishing video in an unnamed city of police officers on Tuesday changing sides and joining the protesters. There you see those images are right there. There was a group of officers, a small group, who joined the demonstrators in the eastern city of Loi Khao. That video also making the rounds. It was also posted on social media. These instances, though, as we say here in France, Phil Robertson, a sparrow doth not the spring make. Is it just isolated incidents?
Well, right now we're seeing more and more civil servants supporting the protests. There have already been clear instances of civil servants, for instance, in the administrative capital, Naypyidaw, taking photos wearing red ribbons out front of their ministries. And we've seen, of course, the teachers and the medical staff saying that they support the civil disobedience movement. Now we see some police coming across. There's two incidents that we know of. The one in Loi Khao in Karenni State in the east is probably the biggest one so far. We haven't seen any sign of the military, and this is the worrisome thing. The police operate under the control of the military. They are the ones who are now out on the front line. They're the ones actually who were involved in that lethal force incident in Naypyidaw. But if the police fail, or if the police prove to be too soft, the concern is that the military will come out on the streets. And we've seen that before. We saw that in 1988. We saw that in 2007. And I think the hope of the people right now is obviously to make sure that these protests are so large and so sustained that the military recognizes that they would face an impossible task to try to repress this situation, and that they'll have to find some degree of compromise. That's the hope we have, but also we need real pressure from the international community. And so far, all we've seen is a lot of talk and not a lot of targeted sanctions and the sort of things we think that are needed to really pressure the military in Myanmar to recognize that they're not going to be able to see this military coup all the way through.
We're supposed to hear, as we speak, from the U.S. President, Phil Robertson, Joe Biden to announce sanctions against Myanmar. But what can he do?
Well, he's going to bring what we understand is an executive order targeting a number of the top military leaders of this coup with global Magnitsky sanctions. These are sanctions focused on specific individuals for human rights violations. We also expect that there will be some targeting of specific companies that are being controlled by the military and operated by the military within Myanmar. So that's a start. And now it will then be up to France and up to the members of the European Union to step up as well.
Cyril Payen, you heard Phil Robertson express his concern, his worry, because there is a track record in Myanmar of a crackdown. You covered in 2007 the so-called Saffron Revolution. Yeah. Is it different this time, though?
Well, it's a good question. It seems that everything is different, but the military. The military state of mind looks like very old, very not adapted to the time of now, and this is how they are maybe, a bit skeptical about what to do. But back to the international community, it remains to be seen if the old reflexes of the military, the Tatmadaw in Myanmar, in Burma, which is very xenophobic, and the more you push them, the more they like it. I don't believe they will very care. And if we specifically talk about, for instance, the new man in charge, Supremo General Min Aung Hlaing, is already targeted by sanctions because of the Rohingya 2017
Yeah, he led
massacre.
the crackdown.
Absolutely. It doesn't prevent him from taking power again. So it remains to be seen if it will be effective, and especially in this pandemic era, which is extremely difficult to cross borders, to be very specifically in touch, and China and Russia are closer than Washington is.
Tun Kin, do you agree with Cyril?
It's very hard to say. We need to wait and see. But, one thing here is this military, who coup leader, he committed genocide, crime against humanity, committed genocide against Rohingya. You all remember 2017, thousands of Rohingya being killed and thousands of Rohingya women raped by this military, and they burn alive Rohingya children. You all know that this coup leader created the world's largest refugee camp in the world, where in Bangladesh, over 700,000 Rohingya fled when they were running for their lives, and these are survivors in Bangladesh today. So this is the same military, the coup leader is now in power. So what can happen? Is very hard to predict, but something may go worse against Rohingya and minorities in Burma, and young generations are moving forward. They calling for inclusive democracy. That is what we want. We do not want to see something so-called democracy in Burma, which happened last few years. That is not right. But we want to see that abolish in 2008 constitution. We want to see the equal rights in Burma, including Rohingyas and other minorities, freedom for all, justice for all. This is what we need to be made for. But this is what the change we're looking for. But we need to see how far the public, this movement can move ahead and how far protesters can go along. But regarding on the Syria, that is hard to predict, hard to say.
Right. Cyril Payen saying there that the country has changed, but not the military. Delano de Souza has more on that.
The military in Myanmar, locally known as Tatmadaw, has ruled with an iron fist since seizing power in 1962. In 2011, after 49 years at the helm, a page was turned. This after the army began to transition the country to what it called a disciplined, flourishing democracy. Well-known figures like Nobel laureate Aung San Suu Kyi and other persecuted pro-democracy politicians were released. Peace talks between opposition leaders and the military were held. Suu Kyi's National League for Democracy party secured a landslide in 2015's election, results which were honored by the military. Around the world, the transition was hailed as a beacon of hope. This despite the fact that the junta never quite went away and continued to wield significant power. The constitution was sanctioned by the army and stipulated it could hold on to a quarter of parliament. Through businesses, the military would control large swathes of the economy, and under the guise of a burgeoning democracy, Myanmar was no longer subjected to sanctions. Human rights abuses showcased the continued power of the army. In 2017, it launched a brutal campaign against the Rohingya Muslim minority. As State Counsel, Aung San Suu Kyi failed to condemn the genocide and tarnished her own image abroad. However, at home, her party's popularity continued to mount. In last November's general election, the NLD won by a landslide, and that's when the military's appetite for democracy started to wane. While the recent coup will rupture relations with the West, the junta can comfortably slip back into old alliances. Just last month, China's foreign minister praised Myanmar's army and said the two countries were brothers. Military dependency has also picked up in recent years from Moscow, the other major player in the region. Many of the armored vehicles used on the street during the coup were made in Russia.
Phil Robertson, can you surmise, or do we have any information as to what's going on inside the high halls of power right now in Myanmar's capital?
We don't have a lot of insight into what the Tatmadaw, the Myanmar military, is actually doing. I mean, we've obviously seen the speeches, we've seen the outlines of their plans in the sense of like setting out their state administrative council, and saying that they're going to have an investigation of the November 2020 election with the brand new Union Election Commission, which is handpicked by them, raising some pretty fundamental questions about how impartial that investigation is going to be. And we know that they're trying to shut down the communications networks. So the latest information we're receiving is that there is a planned cyber crime law that is being drafted by the junta, talking about criminalizing certain actions on the internet. And this may be part, again, of the next step to try to figure out how do they put the internet genie back in the bottle. Because the main difference between what we're seeing now and what we saw back in 2007, or one of the main differences, is that the internet is very widely dispersed across Myanmar. In 2007, people didn't have mobile telephones. They didn't have, a little computer in their pocket, which they could take photos and video and send around the world immediately. There is a connectivity that is a major element, I think, that is driving these protests and enabling them to continue to expand. And, the Myanmar military is trying to strike at that.
We're getting more on what the U.S. president is saying now, Phil. He's saying the military must relinquish power. He's calling for the release of all leaders, including Aung San Suu Kyi, and saying that the U.S. government's taking steps to prevent the generals from having access to $1 billion in Myanmar funds that are held in the U.S. Your reaction?
Well, I think that this is the sort of pressure that is needed. I'm glad that President Biden is taking these steps very proactively. He will have strong bipartisan support in the Congress for those measures, and I expect that there may be further measures coming. But it's also important at this point for the United States to coordinate very closely with the European Union and other like-minded countries, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and others, to make sure that they also bring pressure on Myanmar. There has to be really a sort of very clear united front of pressure against Myanmar that is not going to allow the generals to basically play one country off against another. They have to recognize that the only way out of this situation is by returning power to the people and the representatives that were elected by those people in November 2020.
And what we're seeing right now in the streets of Myanmar is a bit of people power on the part of that younger generation, Generation Z. We'll talk about it more when we come back. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. We're seeing how in Myanmar, despite martial law, despite arrests, people still coming out in the streets. We're talking about it with France 24 senior correspondent Cyril Payan from London, Ton Kin, president of the Burmese Rohingya organization UK, and from Bangkok in Thailand, Phil Robertson, who is the deputy director of Human Rights Watch's Asia Division. A new generation out in the streets of Myanmar with, well, for instance, let's see, we had images of a group of bodybuilders flexing their muscle against the military in Yangon, these images from there, or a group of students from Yangon Technological University who decided to rally outside of the Japanese embassy in, yes, inflatable tubs because why not?
အရာပေါ့နော်ဆိုတော့တခြားနိုင်ငံလူငယ်တွေရောဘယ်လိုလုပ်လဲသူတို့ဆန္ဒတွေဘယ်လိုထုတ်ဖော်လဲဒီလိုအချိန်မှာကိုယ့်အတွက်ကနေပြီးတော့ညီမတို့ကြောင့်အရန်လူငယ်ဖြစ်တဲ့အတွက်ကြောင့်မလို့မခံချင်စိတ်တော့ရှိရပါဒါပေမဲ့အရန် serious ဒီနဲ့အဲ့လိုမျိုးသိရမယ်ကြည်ရမယ်အဲ့ဒါမျိုးမဟုတ်ဘူးညီမတို့ generation ဆက်နဲ့ပြီးညံကောင်းစွာနဲ့ဖော်ထုတ်မယ်ညီမတို့ရဲ့ဆန္ဒတွေကိုသိစေချင်တယ်
Protesters in inflatable tubs. You missed that, Cyril, when you were in Myanmar. Describe the Myanmar of then versus what those images we just saw now.
Well, the only way in common is like when you go back to history, the military, when they refused the vote was in 1990. With the same people, Aung San Suu Kyi, the same percentage of winning by the National League for Democracy, and they kept power not for 1 year, for 25 years. So I guess this young generation, the millennials in Myanmar, looks happy and funny and extremely globalized. But I'm very sure they have in mind that. So this is why, apart from the big change we have seen in a few years, a couple of years, so quick in Yangon or Naypyidaw with these young people now roaming the streets of Yangon, it looks amazing if you compare to 2007, and it's really another country. But this is the same people because they are the sons and daughters of people who have been really, really massacred or who lived under huge pressure by military dictatorship. So I believe, apart from it being very smiley and very globalized and looking like Hong Kongese, even worse than that, we'll say, or you can see the same things like in Bangkok streets, they are still very much Myanmar, Burmese citizens, very involved in politics and defending their freedom.
Yeah, Tun Kin, the big difference, and Phil Robertson alluded to it in part one of our discussion, was the question of whether or not, once the internet has been turned on, whether you can turn it off.
Yeah, that is what military tried to do. Last 2007 and 1988, there is no internet there. Now the internet is there. That is really giving support for this demonstration. Generation Z is really encouraging. New generation, you can see their posters and pictures, what they are holding up, my boyfriend is bad, dictator is worse, and I don't want dictatorship, I want my boyfriend, and those are slogans, I'm going, actually I'm waiting to get my wedding, but I can't wait for my, no need to wait for the wedding, but this movement, I need to continue, those kind of things. This is very, very moving, and I think military will have problem to tackle this group, and I believe that movement will get stronger and stronger, and new young generation, their first initial one is don't mess, me online messed with wrong generation. That are really...
And one of the things we've been talking about since the coup of a week ago Monday, Tun, is that there was the problem with the NLD and Aung San Suu Kyi, which is it had become too monolithic, so that, for instance, and I know this is your cause, when the crackdown on the Rohingya happens, you realize that the broad coalition bringing together various ethnic groups was really no longer there. Is that a fair assessment?
You mean when Aung San Suu Kyi came power, she ignored the ethnic people's rights? That is what you asking for?
Yeah, that's what some people have. That is the charge that some have leveled on this show, saying that what's great about this younger generation is they have a more open mind. Is that true?
Exactly. Yeah, that is what we can see here. This young generation are talking about equal rights and justice for all, freedom for all, because, as I mentioned earlier, previous so-called democratic transition, that is not actually democracy. I don't call it democracy. This is time right now we calling for democracy in Burma. Previous time so-called transition is under 2008 constitution, military top ministers are military, especially main key ministers, defense, home ministry, and border ministers, those are military controlling the country, home ministry, especially police and other forces. So she made a mistake. She did not take seriously about human rights violations. She did not do much thing for the minorities, particularly for the Rohingya. She defended International Court of Justice. For me, this is very important reminder. If you ally with criminals who committed genocide, then they can turn back to you. Now they arrested her. So this is what we can see. She should be stood up, for the ethnic rights and best human rights for everyone, including the Rohingya. She did not, unfortunately. So
Phil, let me bring in Phil Robertson on this. Phil, people watching us from other parts of the world, I think particularly of, say, places like Egypt, where they're celebrating the 10th anniversary of the fall of Hosni Mubarak. If the military never goes away, you have a problem. But how do you make the military go away?
Well, the military in this case in Myanmar is a military that has been engaged in politics and engaged in the economy in a way that really is beyond the pale. I mean, we're talking about a military which controls significant parts of the Myanmar economy. And which has never left politics.
Excuse me, but that sounds like Algeria, that sounds like Egypt, and they never go away.
Well, and what's the result of Algeria and Egypt? I mean, we're talking about autocratic governments which basically repress rights. The situation is, what we're saying is that Myanmar doesn't want to be that. The younger generation doesn't want that. Going back to military dictatorship is their worst nightmare. I mean, they spent almost 5 decades under military dictatorship. And so ultimately, there has to be a fresh break. And there has to be the pressure that needs to be brought to basically get a new day for this Generation Z to be able to continue the democratic experiment, which is ideally rights respecting and becomes more equal and engaged and just for all the people of Myanmar, not just the ethnic Burmans who account for 65%, but all the ethnic peoples, the Karen, the Karenni, the Rohingya, the Rakhine. This is one of the most diverse countries in the world in terms of ethnicity. And it has been a continued problem because the military is trying to basically force everybody to conform to their idea of what the country is. And many people recognize that there has to be a federal charter that respects rights and is democratic. And it's quite clear that the military doesn't want that. And they've moved against that. That's partly that 2008 Constitution that they wrote for themselves is a big part of the problem.
Cyril Payen, is there a new mindset that's capable of staring down the guns?
Probably, but back to what we were saying, the two gentlemen, whereas also it's the trap in which fell Aung San Suu Kyi. And I remember having this conversation with her in Naypyidaw when she was in the parliament in the early years 2000 about how could you compromise so much with your jailers? How would you foresee anything without being having these people accountable for anything from the past? And she was extremely confident and became, as you were saying, very, very much more monolithic, very difficult to engage, very difficult to talk. And this is maybe went to fall. But it was very much a trap. If you underestimate the military, it comes from 2008 with the new constitution design, and they are just using the very much same constitution. They don't even say they did a coup d'etat. They just transfer power because they have the power to do that.
So what do you do if one side has the clever slogans and the other side has the guns?
She's maybe have been too slow and too speedy at the time. Too slow in the compromising, and it was like she fell in the trap in that way, and especially internationally, because nationally, domestically, she's immensely still popular. They are fighting for her in the streets, but too speedy in a way she wouldn't negotiate, and especially after the November election. And then she fell in the trap in that way.
All right, as we were saying on Monday, that younger generation is inspiring others. And while Myanmar's protesters have adopted Thailand's Hunger Games three-fingered salute, Thai protesters have in turn now started banging pots and pans. This Wednesday, several hundred rallied in Bangkok to demand the release of 4 activists remanded in custody after the state threw the book at them Tuesday with charges that include insulting Thailand's king, a crime punishable by 15 years in prison. Sitting in Bangkok, Phil Robertson, would you say there's a Myanmar effect to the rallies we've seen this week?
Well, quite clearly, there is a connection in the sense that the Thai activists want to show solidarity for the Myanmar activists. And there is a broad movement that includes Thailand, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and now Myanmar, called the hashtag Milk Tea Alliance, where you have a younger generation of people operating online to support each other's struggles. And that's why we've seen in the past when the Thai protesters were marching, they were marching with Taiwanese flags, Hong Kong flags, Tibetan flags, a whole range of flags that recognize that they don't agree to be under the thumb of autocratic governments. And I think that we will see more synergies between Myanmar and Thai protesters going forward, that they are learning from each other. And also, I think the Myanmar protesters are learning also more about demonstration tactics, and they're getting manuals on digital security and various different ways to deal with water cannons, all these things that have been learned by the activists in Hong Kong and Thailand, and they're sharing. So, I mean, this is a hopeful aspect of the internet and also the modern communications, that the youth see a commonality of purpose in protesting for human rights and democracy.
You're saying, Cyril Payen, that it works both ways, that law enforcement officials from both sides may also be trading notes. It's not just the demonstrators.
Most probably, because they share experiences, they share a lot of things. There are rumors that even the Myanmar military has requested some advices from the neighboring Thailand junta. So yeah, most probably it works also at this level. I will tend not to be so optimistic about the new trendy thing that you exchange from Hong Kong and you can see in the streets of Rangoon, because at the end of the day, the military get the weapons and they are extremely in charge of the country. So let's hope for the best. The crackdown is looming, I guess.
Yeah, Tun Kin, the Milk and Tea Alliance, how many divisions?
Which one, you mean?
How many divisions, how many soldiers do they have?
They have, in many divisions, they have already, stand by, many militaries. Military in Myanmar, there is about 500,000 over military in Burma. So we do not know so far how they will be putting up the, and yesterday there was a rumors more than 60 military trucks coming into Rangoon division. That is what we heard. And other central Burma, there are many military.
No, but the question I had for you was when you have on the one side hashtags and on the other side guns, what do you do,
I think this is the generation, that we can see young generation, they will not give up, but I don't think the military can do the same way like 1988 and 2007. That is what I feel. One thing here is we need international community pressure. International community is not doing enough, not sufficient the way they put pressure. It's not a time concern and condemn. We want to see practical action. We've been calling many days now so far, but we have seen some welcome in that Human Rights Council session, a special session tomorrow, and UN Security Council discussion went through, but there is no such action. So that is encouraging to the military, and that can bring the military. That could be worse for the to crack down, and they can come up to the street. The military that can be very, very difficult at time. So what I think here is we want to see international community immediately to call on Burmese military, not to do anything against the people who are doing peaceful protests, and military should, should relinquish the power, and we want to see inclusive democracy in Burma where Rohingyas, other minorities, they can have full rights in the country.
Cyril Payen, when we look at outside pressure, we talk about activists from other countries. We talk about the role of the United States in part one of our discussion. Of course, there's one neighbor of Myanmar we haven't talked about up to now, and that's China. Which side of the fence is China on, or will China wait to see where the chips fall before going all in one side or the other?
It's difficult to say. If you take the picture at first step, it looks like China is totally supporting the Myanmar government. He's very supportive to the military, but also Xi Jinping had some close relationship he built with Aung San Suu Kyi. So there is something where it could be diplomatically a gap. For instance, from the Washington new administration, maybe to talk to the Chinese to try to make some kind of pressure. They also support indirectly some ethnic insurgency, namely the Kachin on the Chinese border. So there is a game to play, which is ending in the streets every day for the fifth day now of the country. But the international pressure won't be out of talking directly to the big power close to the military and close to the neighboring Myanmar.
Phil Robertson, in the decades since Myanmar opened up, trade with China has diminished. What would be in Beijing's interest to have the junta go away?
Well, I think that there is certainly a lot of time that China spent investing in the relationship with Aung San Suu Kyi. There seems to be mixed messages coming from Beijing. On one hand, they agreed to the UN Security Council statement when many people thought that they would not. On the other hand, they defended Myanmar in some ways to make sure that the statement wasn't more harsh. We believe that they're primarily interested in the economic projects that they're doing to sort of create the economic corridor through Myanmar. And whatever they can do to get that done will be the big part of it. But they also are major supporters of the Northern Alliance rebel groups, including the United Wa State Army, which has Chinese battle tanks and surface-to-air missiles. And, those have been provided to China, and that insurgent group is holding a huge part of that border outside of control of the Myanmar military, and they're not happy about that. So it's not an easy relationship between Myanmar and China. And people who sort of simplistically say that any sort of pressure from the West is going to push Myanmar into the arms of the Chinese, I think, have not spent enough time studying the situation in Myanmar.
We're going to have to leave it there. Much more to talk about as this story unfolds. The future is unwritten when it comes to Myanmar. Phil Robertson in Bangkok, many thanks for joining us. I want to thank Tun Kin in London, Cyril Payen, and we want to thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.